DairyXNet would like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Formulating Diets for Groups of Lactating Dairy Cows. I'd like to welcome everyone and introduce myself. I'm Donna Amaral Phillips, Extension Dairy Specialist and Extension Professor here at the University of Kentucky. And our speaker today is Dr. Bill Weiss. He is a professor and extension specialist in dairy cattle nutrition in the Department of Animal Sciences at The Ohio State University. He's located in Worcester, Ohio, on the outskirts of the main campus. His main research areas include factors affecting digestion of cows, relationships between minerals and vitamins and the health they have, effects on health of dairy cows, and also the effects of diet variability on productivity of dairy cows. He has authored more than 110 journal articles and 350 extension-type articles. He is board certified in nutrition through ARPIS, and he is also a member of the 2001 Dairy NRC Committee, and he currently serves as the vice chair of the new Dairy NRC Committee that has just been put together. With that, Bill, we welcome you today to talk about this topic.
Thank you, and hello from snowy and cold Worcester, Ohio. We're going to talk about formulating for pens. Even though most of us use ration software, we need to think more of how the structure of a pen affects the numbers, the input numbers we put into these diets or into these computer softwares. I am not going to talk about how people or why you should group cows. There's lots of different reasons, but what I do want to talk about is the decision you make to group or how you group is going to affect the numbers you put into this ration software. And we can group by production, you can group by parity, stage of lactation. There's lots of reasons. What I want to talk about is how, if you group by production, for example, the distribution of milk yields within that pen will be different than if you group by parity or whatever. So your grouping decisions affect the distributions of milk yields. It also affects the distributions of dry matter intakes within that pen, which again has impacts on formulation specs. And so we have to consider more than just average milk yield or pen average dry matter intake when we formulate. We have to think about how do these distributions, I'm going to keep talking distributions rather than data points, affect inputs. This is an example. The triangle there could be, these are arbitrary units. This triangle here is just, say, a given cow. You're balancing a diet for cow X, and it needs 50 units of requirements. And we would punch that into the thing, and the computer would tell us you need 50 units of requirements. But when we're talking of pens, you're going to have animals with low requirements and animals with high requirements. And so the question is, which requirement do we use to formulate a diet? You have to remember within that pen, you also have a range of intakes. You might know pen average intake, but you do not know how much cow 46 is eating or cow 103 is eating. And this helps us in a way, or the fact that we have distributions of dry matter intake, that helps in a way, but it also complicates ration formulation. So start thinking of distributions, not single points. The other thing is, within pens, within farms, you're going to have different distributions. And as an example here, I have this black line. Let's just say this is milk production. High variation in this particular pen. Contrast to this blue line where all the milk productions are pretty tight. You should have different formulation specs for this distribution of pens, or this pen distribution, than if this was your pen. You will formulate to different goals. I'm going to talk about, because of time and complexity, I'm going to assume that within a pen, the milk production, the nutrient requirements, and the dry matter intake fit a normal distribution, this bell-shaped curve. But if you have distributions like this red line, things might be very different. But again, for this seminar, I'm just going to assume we have a bell-shaped curve, but I'm not going to make any assumptions as to how wide that curve is. So in ration software, almost every computer program asks for milk yield, body weight, milk composition, and parity or growth, some measure of that. And so the question is, what really matters, what's really going to affect requirement calculations, and what doesn't? So over here, what I did is I have a small cow, a 900-pound cow, and a 1,500-pound cow. And so that's pretty different. And again, within a pen on a farm, this probably represents about as big a spread as you're going to get. And that's these lines over here. So I've got these two cows, the 900-pounder and the 1,500-pound cow, both producing 75 pounds of milk. And you can quibble whether this is realistic or not. That's not the point here. All I want to say is this is the energy requirement. This is the metabolizable requirement, protein requirement. A huge change in body weight has almost no effect on MP requirement, and a very small effect on net energy requirement. So big change in body weights, minimal effect on requirements. Then these bars over here, now I have an average cow is weighing 1,200 pounds, which is the average of this. But I have a 50 pounds of milk per day and 100 pounds. So a 50-pound spread. And again, within a pen, that's probably not the maximum spread you're going to have, but it's a pretty good spread in productions. And look at the effect it has on requirements. From going from 50 to 100 pounds of milk, I increase energy requirements by 64%. I increase protein requirements by more than 50%. So milk clearly is driving requirements. When we look at milk composition, here I've got a lower testing cow, 3.3 fat and 2.7, versus a higher testing cow, 4.2 fat and 3.2 protein. So again, you're within a farm, you probably have more diversity than this, but this is pretty diverse. These two milk compositions at equal milk weights only affect energy and protein by about 13%. So again, not huge. Parity. If I have an animal with no true growth versus an animal that's growing 1.6 pounds a day, so this could be a first lactation cow versus a third lactation cow. If everything is equal, that only affects requirements by about 10%. So again, it's milk yield is driving the show here. These other things aren't that important, or variation in the other ones. Now we have to think about intake. Intake and milk yield, the same relative effects that I just showed you are true for intake. A bigger cow eats more, but not that much more. A high-producing cow eats more than a low-producing cow, and it's a substantial increase. So these relationships, body weight and milk yield, are similar quantitatively to both requirements and intake. But with intake, we have this days in milk effect, which has, by itself, has almost no effect on nutrient requirements. In other words, a cow at 5 days in milk compared to a cow at 500 days in milk, if they weigh the same and if they're producing the same amount of milk, have essentially the same requirements. But days in milk can have a huge effect on dry matter intake. And I'm going to keep coming back to this because that has a major effect on nutrient specs. And this just shows you, this is a study we did, and I picked this particular cow because she at one time in her career, or in her lactation, she produced 100 pounds of milk here at about 30 days. And then at about 120 days, she produced 100 pounds as well. So the requirements at 100, 110 days here and 30 days are virtually the same. But look at intake. This cow has to produce 100 pounds of milk eating only 46 pounds, because then this is measured intakes. This cow produces 100 pounds, but she gets to eat 55 pounds. So again, if I have these early lactation cows, because they eat so little, I have to take that into a consideration if I'm formulating for a group. So to sum up this part, body weight, use a pen or herd average. You don't need to worry about diversity in body weights. Milk composition, use a mean. You do not have to worry about diversity. Parity, again, minor effects, just use the mean. If you've got first, second, and third lactation cows in there, punch in second lactation. But milk yield and days in milk, huge effects, and that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to divide the rest of this talk into 3 sections. One is, and it's all based on how you separate cows relative to days in milk. And so the question I always ask first is, does the pen you're going to feed include fresh cows? And for this seminar, I'm going to define a fresh cow as up to about 3 weeks in milk. You could go 4, but around 3 weeks. So that's a critical question when you're formulating for pens. If the pen is just fresh cows, so after 3 weeks they get moved someplace else, and I'll get a little more detail later, this pen is going to be formulated with one goal in mind, and that's get them to eat. If I can get a fresh cow to eat, everything goes fine. So emphasis here is not necessarily meeting requirements. It's getting cows to eat, because if they eat, they will meet requirements. So that's a nice separation. Then another separation, if you have a pen of just fresh cows, then you're going to have a pen or more pens of cows that are not fresh, and we'll spend some time on there. It becomes more difficult when you have pens with both fresh cows and later lactation cows, so like a one-group TMR. This is very nutritionally inefficient, because you've got these huge differences in intake and not that difference in milk yield. And we can't forget, when I feed a fresh cow, if I feed a fresh cow incorrectly, it's not just going to hurt production today or tomorrow. It may hurt production the entire lactation, because I might affect peaks, and we all know what that will do. So this situation here is difficult, but I will discuss that. Okay, so let's start with, I've got now, for the next several slides, I'm going to say I've got a group of cows that do not contain fresh cows. So I'm going to call this my post-fresh group. Rule number 1. Never, ever, ever formulate to the average cow. You will always lose milk. So if the pen average is 75 pounds and you formulate a diet that supports 75 pounds, eventually that pen will produce less than 75 pounds. So we don't formulate to averages. The reason for that is this is just a hypothetical response curve saying as I increase nutrients, it never looks this good in real world, but the increased nutrient production increases until something else is limiting production. You know, if I have a cow at 500 days in milk, I can feed her all the protein in the world and she's not going to produce any more milk. Physiology is limiting production. So the nutrient will continue to increase production until a given point. And when you formulate to a mean, say here we have, and I'm using protein as an example, you can put whatever you want here on the x-axis. If I feed this average cow, what that means is half the cows, this half here, I don't increase these cows here with this low protein requirement. I'm not going to get an ounce more milk from these cows because I'm feeding those cows more protein. Something else is limiting. So half the cows in that group, I don't get an increase in milk production by exceeding their requirement. On the other hand, on the 50% of the cows that have a higher requirement, if I feed the average cow, I will lose production. So you don't gain on this side, and you lose on this side, which is why you never, ever, ever balance for the average cow. Okay, this is just an example herd here. It's actually my neighbor's herd who has individual milk weights. So I got data from him one day, and this just reflects a herd, a pen. It is not, it's just an example. In this particular pen, these are kilos down there. I gave this talk in Europe. But so the blue here, I've converted these to pounds. So you have cows in here. The average is 75 pounds, 110 cows in this pen. You had some cows producing as little as 35 pounds and some cows producing as much as 130 pounds. And then you have the standard deviation of 13. So the question is, what do you formulate to? I just said you don't formulate to 75, but what do you? Well, if you would formulate to 75 pounds, say that, so you formulated a diet based on pen average intake to support 75 pounds of milk, you will get more than, there will be cows in that pen that produce more than 75 pounds of milk. And really, if this is a normal distribution, bell-shaped curve, if I feed for the average cow, I'm actually providing enough nutrients for about 80% of the cows in that pen. So that's the red box. These cows are going to be fed adequate or excess. So the reason I'm getting, here, I could get as much as 90 pounds even though the diet was formulated for 75, and the reason I get that is because cows eat more as they produce more. But on these very high producing cows, they cannot eat enough more of that average diet to meet their requirements. So you lose here. If I feed to the average, I'm going to have, these cows are going to still be okay, but these cows become these cows. So we shift the distribution and we lower the mean. So just as a general rule, if your pen is approximately a normal distribution of milk yields, you should be able to support about 15% above the mean. So in the previous example, the average pen production was 75 pounds. I should be able to get 85 to 90 pounds of milk out of that diet. So if you don't have any cows above 90 pounds, you won't necessarily reduce pen average production. But that would be a very, very tight pen, where if the average was 75 and the highest cow was only 90, in that example, you would not reduce production. But again, that's not very realistic. This is for protein and energy, and metabolizer for protein and energy, but I want to quickly go into what about other nutrients here. How does pen logistics or pen demographics affect other nutrients? Well, for minerals and vitamins, not a lot. I don't make different formulations for diverse pens or not diverse pens. I use the mean because there's so many other factors that affect mineral requirements. And again, a general rule here to cover all these uncertainties and possible antagonists, if you're at 20 to 50% above NRC, independent of the cow distribution, you'll be fine. On fiber, or NDF, this is more complicated, and this is beyond what I can talk about here in 30 minutes. But again, there's many other things I'm going to consider on when I'm come up with a fiber spec other than distributions of milk yield, things like feeding management, the starch source, so on. But one thing you need to think about is if you have a pen that has a substantial number of fresher cows, not, again, I'm not having these real fresh cows in here, but earlier lactation cows with lower days in milk and higher production, I'm going to tend to go on the lower NDF side. Whereas if I have a pen that's heavier on lower producing, later lactation cows, I will increase NDF. But be very careful on NDF, and remember, it's much more important than just pen demographics. The last nutrient before I get back to MP and net energy is degradable protein. Degradable protein requirement is not a function of the cow or of milk production. It's a bacteria requirement, and it's tied to intake. The more a cow eats, the more energy for bugs. The more energy bugs have, the more rumen degradable protein they need. Some things you should keep in mind. One is this is not an expensive nutrient in general. So that would say you can afford to feed extra. But you have to couch that in that excess RDP may have some negative effects on repro. This usually you have to be pretty high, but it increases manure nitrogen. So there's both environmental regulations and then just good stewardship, demands that we don't increase nitrogen excretion too much. But on the plus side, rumen degradable protein above requirement has been shown to stimulate feed intake. Rumen degradable protein above requirement has been shown to improve fiber digestion. So you don't want to be deficient. You want to make sure you have enough. But because this isn't a function of milk production, it's really not that dependent on your demographics in the pen. Using the NRC model, and if you're using other software, your set point will be different, so keep that in mind. This is just showing you this is the requirement here. This is dry matter intake, and they kept getting increased intake with higher and higher RDP. So there's reason to exceed NRC requirements, and I think just generally all pens, regardless of distribution of milk yields, are going to be somewhere around 5% above requirement. And it doesn't matter if you have a wide diversity of milk productions or not. So let's get to the two nutrients that matter, and that's digestible RUP, which is going to make up the MP, and energy. So we can feed for the average cow, which means that high-producing cows are going to have inadequate MP, and milk production will go down. Or we can feed for above average, which you should do, but that has a cost. It increases feed cost, and it increases nitrogen in manure. So it is a balancing act. And there is an optimum, which depends on economics and environmental regulations. So, in general, this gets us back to this graph I showed you earlier. If you take the mean milk production, which in this example was 75 pounds, and you take one standard deviation, if you know the standard deviation, and in this example it was 13, so the mean plus one standard deviation is 88 pounds. So I should be formulating my diet for MP allowable milk at 88 pounds using pen average intakes. So if this pen was eating 50 pounds, I'd punch that in and I'd formulate a diet that had MP allowable milk of 88, not 75. So this mean plus one standard deviation in milk is the maximum. I want to emphasize, that's the maximum safety factor you're going to formulate for. The economic optimum might be less. I can't get into that. That's too complicated for this short talk. But plus the mean plus one standard deviation is the maximum you should be feeding for MP allowable milk. What that means, though, is you need to know the standard deviation of milk yields in that pen. Sometimes people will have it. They will have record systems that allow that, but a lot of times you don't. And this just shows here, I've got 3 example herds. One is a pretty tight. The pen standard deviation was 10. In all cases here in this example, average production is 85 pounds. 10 standard deviation, a 15, or a 20. So if I had a pretty tight herd or pretty tight pen, I'm going to formulate to 95 pounds. If it's a little more diverse, I'm going to formulate to 100 pounds using in this instead of 85. And if it's really diverse, I'm going to formulate to 105 pounds. So the more diversity in your pens, you have to over-formulate more and more, which is a good reason you try to keep milk yields relatively similar within a pen. So just as a wrap-up of this part, I'm going to use pen average dry matter intake. My maximum MP allowable milk is mean milk plus 1 standard deviation. At this time, if you don't know the standard deviation, this is my best guess. And this is based on data from Ohio herds that within a pen, they have the average was about a 16%, the standard deviation was about 16% of the mean. So if you know pen average milk times 0.16, that's going to give you an estimate of the standard deviation. And again, that's our best guess right now. So in this example, they're eating 58 pounds. They're producing on average 90 pounds. And I don't know the standard deviation for this example. So I'm going to use 90 times 0.16. My estimated standard deviation is 14 pounds. So my MP allowable milk is the mean, 90, plus the standard deviation, 14. I'm going to formulate for 100, or I want my MP allowable milk to be 104 pounds at a 58 pound intake. Okay, now net energy is a lot tougher, I think, because in theory, net energy allowable milk should equal average milk, because cows that are producing more will lose condition, but then when they become lower than average production, they gain it back. So in theory, that you would just have any allowable milk would equal average. But there's a lot of uncertainties in predicting or estimating NEL, so I think this is my opinion. You can argue with me. I can't support this. It's just an opinion. But I think on average you should start by overfeeding net energy, or net energy allowable milk should be about 10% above average. But follow body condition closely. And if you start seeing fat cows, back it down. If you start seeing too many thin cows, increase it. So be aware, net energy is a calculated number, and there's a lot of error. Okay, now let's get back to these fresh cows. So if you have a pen here, and if you have fresh cows in this pen, these guys are very different in that there's not a good connection between production and intake. For all these cows out here, there's a good correlation between the more they milk, the more they eat. But this early lactation group, they can be high-producing cows, relatively high-producing cows, and still have very low intakes. That's the problem. So if we have a group, and this all we could do here is simulate some stuff. So if we have now a group that includes fresh cows, so it's what I'm going to be calling a diverse group. So there's fresh cows and later lactation cows, and your actual decision on where you're going to go is how many fresh cows are in that pen. If you have a lot, you're going to bias it heavily toward fresh cows. If you don't have very many, then you're still biasing it a little toward fresh cows, but less and less. And again, the reason you tend to bias your results more toward feeding that fresh cow adequately is because what you do that first couple weeks is going to set her up for a whole lactation. But in this simulation, what we assumed was 10% of the pen was fresh cows, less than 25 days. We assumed a normal lactation curve. And what we came up with is, again, using pen average intakes, instead of 1 standard deviation, it's actually, I'm going to formulate for 1.5 standard deviations. I'm going to overfeed more, and again, because now I have to make sure I feed these fresh cows correctly, and they eat so little compared to what their herd mates are. This is the safety factor. So diverse pen with fresh cows, average milk plus 1.5 standard deviations. Early lactation group, again, intake. When you're formulating a diet of cows that are just fresh, up to 3-4 weeks, think about what can you do to get cows to eat. And a lot of this is well known. This RDP, I'm going to make sure there's adequate RDP because there's good evidence saying it stimulates intake. Moderate fiber, moderate starch, highly digestible fiber, and then all the feed management things, bunk space, stall space, everything else. I do not get concerned about net energy in this group at all because, again, I want them to eat. So don't worry too much about the energy concentration. Worry about feed intake. Okay, so to wrap up here, if at all possible to be nutritionally efficient, fresh cows go into their own group. You can afford to feed these a more expensive diet. You can, this by keeping these cows in their own group, you can feed the other groups closer to actual requirements. If for pens without fresh cows, if you know the variation, you can be much more specific on your nutrient specs. So knowing standard deviations of milk yields within a pen is useful information. And I'm going to set my maximum MP allowable milk using pen average intakes at the average milk plus 1 standard deviation. And again, right now, our best guess, if you don't know the standard deviation, assume it's 16% of the mean, so that would be what you do there. But again, and this average standard deviation or this estimated standard deviation can be really wrong, depending on how you group your cows. For diverse groups, and this would be pens with later lactation and fresh cows, you have to overfeed more because you cannot afford to shortchange fresh cows. This adds to feed cost, but it should be overall profitable. The best thing would be to get these cows, the fresh cows, into their own pen. But if you can't, you have to overfeed, increase feed costs, but that should in the long run result in better milk production because you did not shortchange fresh cows. So for these groups, maximum MP allowable milk is actually the average milk production plus 1.5 standard deviations, not 1 like it would be if the pen didn't have fresh cows. And with that, I thank you for your attention and be happy to try and answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Bill. If anyone has any questions, please type in the chat box. Looks like Mike Hutchins is typing a question for you, Bill.
Well, I don't have to answer his. So. Just kidding.
No, we really thank you for doing this, Bill. And also, we would greatly appreciate if people would take some time and fill out our survey. It really helps us as far as decide what kind of webinars we have, as far as topics out there, and also as far as how we manage these particular webinars as far as time factors, the length of the webinar, and that type of thing. So please take a few minutes and go through and look at that. So one of the questions that Mike had is, do you have a program source for farmers to calculate standard deviation?
No, I don't, but if, just about any spreadsheet now, Excel or any of those, if you have the individual milk weights, you punch them into Excel, and they have a function that would calculate it very quickly. But so getting the standard deviation, calculating isn't the problem, but a lot of people just will not have individual milk weights. But like I said, we just use Excel here.
He has another question. I guess while he's typing his question in, Bill, I have one. As far as from a practical standpoint, obviously our audience today is a lot of nutritionists, but also farmers who work with their nutritionists. What kind of questions should they ask their nutritionist to see if they're targeting the right milk production, as far as from printouts and that type of thing?
Like I said, to me, the most critical thing is are there fresh cows in that pen? And if there are, then you start saying, is this diet? You can do some simulations, for example, and you have to estimate milk production and estimate intake of these very fresh cows and run the diet you have and see, is this shortchanging these cows too much? But this too often, I think people don't think about how many fresh cows, what proportion of the cows in this pen are fresh, and that has to be considered in ration formulations on specs. We have to overfeed, we know that, but again, overfeeding too much inflates feed cost, and then again, we cannot ignore this environmental issue. So fresh cows, ask about fresh cows.
So as a number of fresh cows, let's assume they have two groups. two-group herd, a smaller herd on there, so the number of fresh cows would dictate what the specs of that ration should be.
Yeah,
it probably changes over the year.
Exactly. If I was at a period of time where I wasn't having a lot of calvings, I would probably lower my over-formulation. And then if it got to a point where I'm going to be having a fair number of fresh cows, then I will get closer to that 1.5 standard deviations. But again, if I have 100 cows in my pen and I have one fresh cow, I'm not going to overfeed 99 cows for the one. So think about how many, but even if there's just a handful of fresh cows, because you're going to be paying for how you feed those, you're going to set that whole lactation up, I'm still going to bias it. So it might be if I have 5% fresh cows, if I had 10% fresh cows in the pen, I'm going to use probably pretty close to that 1.5 standard deviations. If I was at 5, I might try 1.2 or 1.3 standard deviations. So I'm still overfeeding, but not as much.
Mike continued with that question. He asked if DHI should actually calculate standard deviations for, especially for strings of cows.
I think that would be great. Yeah, I think that would be a great service for the pen. Again, if you're going to formulate diets for a certain pen, and if DHI would say today or on the day they took the records, the pen average was 80 pounds with a standard deviation of 10, it would be very useful. And again, if the data is there, it's easier to use than if you have to take that data, punch it into a spreadsheet, and get a number. So I think that would be an excellent addition.
And that would be a great place for farmers to really communicate with their nutritionists if there was big changes from one month to the next.
And the other thing, if you see, if it's got to be a big enough farm where you can group, but if you saw a standard deviation of the average was 70 pounds of milk with a standard deviation of 25, that would tell me, boy, if I'd group by production, I might get that standard deviation down to 10, and think of how much money I could feed because I don't have to overformulate so much. So it'd also be a teachable tool on, by grouping more by production, you have to overfeed less, and that saves money.
Well, Bill, we really thank you for doing this today, and I think you have a lot of points that farmers can and the nutritionists can use to look at how we make dairy herds a lot more profitable. Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you.